Language is inherent to the manifestation of culture. As the essential tool humans have to communicate ideas, thoughts, emotions, values, beliefs, and customs, it plays a unique social role in fostering the notions of both individual and group identity, as well as in the consistency of the components that make up a specific society. Language is a means by which cultural and artistic traditions, principles, and values are shared, passed on from one generation to another, and therefore preserved by the participants of any existing culture. I am a Cuban political exile in the United States that migrated nearly 12 years ago at the age of 39. Therefore, my culture and ethnic identity are deeply rooted in the use of the Spanish language, as well as in the complex array of elements that make up Cubanhood as a national identity. I make use of the word Cubanhood in English with the intent of conveying a meaning similar to that of the Spanish term cubanía, some other people say cubanidad, a noun that signifies the notion of being born in Cuba and the somewhat passionate national identity of a people from the largest of the Antilles. On the other hand, I learned English at a relatively early age because of educational and personal reasons. After I moved to the United States, I underwent the inevitable and still ongoing process of cultural adaptation by being exposed to the dynamics of American society and by interacting with different majority, minority, institutional, and social groups. A few years ago, I used to state that I identified myself as a bilingual Cuban exile in the United States. The reason I first declare that I'm a Cuban political exile is because I still feel active and responsibly committed to the duty of changing the destiny of my oppressed native country. Even though I saw myself virtually compelled to migrate due to political reasons, I still struggle against the dictatorship that afflicts my people, one of the reasons that keeps me tightly connected to other compatriots that share the same political ideas, visions, purpose, and expectations. Besides, I can't escape the certainty that we Cubans, as many other groups of migrants in the United States, have a reputation for keeping attached to our language and cultural values long after migrating from our island. Cubans' mass migration has developed into a worldwide diaspora of individuals that willfully adapt to other cultures without giving up their essence of Cubanhood. As a matter of fact, and as it happens in most nations of the Western Hemisphere, our national identity is truly composed of different intermingled pieces that include European, African, Asian, and Amerindian influences. The keenness to Cuba's polyrhythmic music genres, understanding the syncretized religious practices where Catholicism and other Christian denominations coexist, and curiously intermix with the religious rites that African slaves brought from Congo, Angola, and Nigeria during more than 400 years of Spanish colonialism. The celebrated Cuban cuisine that is regularly claimed to be autochthonous, but is truly an amalgam of Mediterranean, African, Cantonese, and Amerindian dishes and recipes. And the use of this distinctive accent terminology of a dialectal variant that has devolved to a controversial Spanish language use after 60 years of oppressive isolationism. And yes, the sempiternal presence of strong black coffee, tobacco, and rum are some of the clearly seen foundational blocks that sustain the edifice of my personal Cuban identity. I shouldn't overlook the fact that my integration process to life in the United States has permitted me to recover my pedagogical career as well. More than a profession as such, being a teacher became my most prized way of life when I lived back in Cuba. Nothing compares to the professional realization of positively impacting the lives of youth and watching them develop into successful citizens. At present, I have been able to return to my career as an instructor in higher education, and I have enrolled this doctoral program with the intention of having access to more opportunities as a pedagogue. Therefore, I think I should reinstate my prior statement and declare that I identify myself as a bilingual Cuban exiled English teacher in the United States. Spanish is my mother tongue. It was the first material channel I could use to express my thoughts and feelings, as well as to interact with my social context. I received my elementary, secondary, and part of my higher education in my native language. All my first cognitive, emotional, social, intellectual, and professional experiences were in Spanish. And this is still the dominant language of my inner voice when I think, when I count, when I dream, and when I pray. Although I occasionally do some of those things in English as well. I first learned English as a foreign language, and it developed into my most important working instrument as both an English teacher and a professional in the tourist industry. After moving to the United States, my English grew to a new dimension as it became my second language, and I believe that my integration process in the United States has mostly been a conscious process without giving up my ethnic and language heritage. On the other hand, I feel that I have undergone an unavoidable transformation that has considerably impacted my language and cultural identity. The fact of being a bilingual professional has been advantageous for my career development, and it has also transcended the sheer benefit of opening doors to new job opportunities, and it has become an inseparable component of who I am as an individual. There is a strong presence of Hispanic migrants in the Miami-Dade County, and my knowledge of Spanish has allowed me to assess and adapt to my relatively new language environment more profoundly. Consequently, my language development in English has also been affected by my exposure to other Hispanic cultures and my interaction with other Spanish-speaking nationality groups. My knowledge of different variants of the language has been considerably enriched, and I don't often use my native Cuban Spanish as a result of my cultural awareness. Instead, I ascribe to the use of a local variant, a locally formed variant that tends to be friendlier to Spanish speakers from other countries, people that are represented in the particularly diverse Miami area. This local Miamian Spanish is characterized by the avoidance of terms that are used with different meanings in other nations, some of which may even be interpreted as offensive, and has other distinctive elements that relate to grammar, phonology, and lexicology. Now, being an applied linguist has also influenced the way I connect to my second language. I can't help constantly comparing English and Spanish from a linguistic perspective. And my second language and cultural ethnic identities have consequently been affected by the way in which I view, understand, and use English. If I first started seeing English as a foreign language, the social context within which I currently interact has given a new shape to that perspective, so that I now embrace the use of my second language from the standpoint of a more multicultural Hispanic heritage and from the professional view of an applied linguist. And this is an ongoing process that constantly incorporates new elements to my individual language and my individual cultural identity. My first contact with English as a foreign language took place during my early adolescence. I started taking basic English lessons at my middle school in 7th grade. Although I must have had some previous contacts with the language through my elder brother and my father, two avid foreign language learners, it wasn't until that time that I focused on learning English. First, because it was a required subject at school, and second, and most expressively, because I started to consume music in English. At school, the lessons were very basic, rather unproductive. We were a class of about 45 students, and the only model we could follow was a teacher who was very good, but he could only do so much. He had no other choice but to adhere to a very simple syllabus. But at the same time, aside from some exposure to the inevitable Billboard music hits that could pass the Cuban Ministry of Culture's censorship, I started listening to rock and roll, which seemed fascinating to me. I remember how eager I felt to understand the lyrics of those songs, and my friends and I would pass around notebooks filled with words of famous hits by those British progressive rock and roll bands. I later realized those notebooks were plagued with errors and mistakes, but I regard this process as my initiation, my real initiation with English as a foreign language. When I finished my 9th grade, I didn't know much English at all, but I had the innermost notion that I had to learn it somehow. According to the second language acquisition theories studied in class, my English learning experience during this period could be associated to the input-based emergentists' perspectives. Since the little language content I acquired during that time was basically bottom-up, trying to interpret the new language by making sense of its structure and patterns from the restricted input that we had. But the frequency of the exposure to the new language was too limited, and the feedback was almost inexistent. I remember how I later needed to unlearn language material that I had wrongly acquired, a very hard process. Now, later in high school, I started learning Russian, and I found it exciting. Since that was really my first true experience learning a foreign language in a more formal and intensive manner. Unfortunately, I no longer remember much of the Russian I learned. During that same period, my brother went to the former USSR to take his master's in mechanical engineering, and I remember how passionately we would talk about the Russian language and culture when he'd come on vacation. I became very interested in Russian classical literature, but I didn't really achieve enough mastery of this language to read the original versions of such complex pieces, so I had to read Pushkin and Dostoevsky in Spanish. And I still treasure my old vinyl records of Stravinsky, Tchaikovsky, as a memento from my exposure to Russian culture. However, I regard my Russian learning process as a most useful subsequent mediator for my English learning experience. I remember how I consciously replicated some of the logical, psychological learning processes that I had previously employed to learn Russian in order to learn the new foreign language. When I became 18 and had to go to college, the only opportunity I had was to become an English teacher. I had dropped out of a military academy, and there weren't any other higher education openings at the time I applied, by the end of August. So, possibly due to my history as an unexceptional, to say the least, student, I dreaded the idea of becoming a teacher and spending the rest of my life confined to the four walls of a classroom. I was more inclined to pursue my professional future as an electric engineer, an industry with which I was relatively familiar because of my father's job. But the other choice I really had was to spend 2 years serving the Cuban Army, and the mere thought of it made me afraid. 3 years at the military academy had taught me that I personally didn't have anything to do with life in the military. So I decided to seize the moment, seize the opportunity. I had to evade the army, and with the intent to change my career path after the required first 2 years in college, I simply started. I didn't know at that time that I would immediately embrace my pedagogical career in English with passion, a passion I had never felt before. It was the two things, becoming a teacher and learning English. The more I studied, the more I became involved with both the history, culture, and literature of the English-speaking peoples, as well as with the perspective of becoming a teacher in the image of the excellent staff I found at my college's English department. They had a very well-deserved nationwide reputation. During my first 3 years in college, I took 4 hours of intensive English every morning from Monday to Friday. The syllabi were designed in Cuba, including the studio audio recordings utilized as models, and the pedagogy was mostly based on the audiolingual and the structural methods. We would spend long hours doing rote repetition and role plays to get as close as possible to the American native accent. But our curricular also included material made in the UK, and this issue caused inconsistencies in our language production, chiefly in the oral skill. Now, in my 4th year in college, the English department started to adopt the communicative method. We started then using courses edited in the United States, as well as other possible materials that included realia in the form of live broadcasts. I remember this show, Special English, a radio show transmitted on the Voice of America, as well as Casey Kasem's long-distance dedications. This practice led to the already existing conflict that English language learners had with the Cuban political police due to ideological issues. So being constantly watched and repressed was another thing, one of the countless reasons that gradually turned me into a political dissident. The efforts of our teachers to have us exposed to an artificial English language social context contributed to our communicative competence from the perspective of the second language acquisition cognitive theorists. However, the lack of real-life interaction in English prevented us from developing other competencies that I later started to build after my contact with English-speaking tourists, and some years later, through my adaptation process in the United States. I officially worked as a teacher of English as a foreign language for about 8 years. Due to the extreme economic crisis Cuba was going through, I changed my career and I started doing different jobs in the tourist industry. However, I continued teaching and doing professional translations as a freelance consultant for as long as I lived in the island. During my short-lived pedagogical experience as an English teacher working for the Cuban Ministry of Education, I suffered what I would call a personal paradigmatic shift. My teaching evolved from being a challenging occupation into a way of life. Therefore, giving up my formal practice was traumatic. It was a traumatic interruption of what I regard as my true calling, being an educator. Even though I started making a better living in the tourist industry, I still longed with incomparable passion for the years I spent teaching English as a foreign language. Among other administrative occupations I did for the tourist industry, I spent about 4 years working as a tour guide, a job that allowed me to interact with native speakers mainly from Canada and the United Kingdom. Such routine exposure to authentic English helped me gain a deeper insight into the use of the spoken language on both sides of the Atlantic, and my vocabulary was considerably expanded too. It was a very relevant cultural experience that somehow compensated my professional frustration. I believe that my learning process is far from being over, and when I look back at all the different ways by means of which I acquired the linguistic material I currently possess, and I recognize a heterogeneous mixture of external elements, including my exposure to the language and the methods my teachers utilized, as well as other inner processes related to my personal motivation to learn and the psychological factors involved in making English my own, even though it will always remain as my second language.